You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on August 20th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. All right, friends. Well, it's good to be back with you after a couple weeks away. On vacation, I was reflecting on this theme of rest a bit for obvious reasons, but also because we live in restless times. You know, it's like everywhere we turn, there's noise, urgency, or pressure. Our news cycles are never ending. Our phones are buzzing with updates we don't ask for. Our calendars are packed. And even our leisure time often feels like just one more thing we have to plan or manage, you know? And beneath all of this, many of us carry the habits of our capitalist-driven culture that tie our self-worth to productivity. And even in retirement, did you know studies show people often struggle to slow down, feeling they must keep working or stay busy in order to justify their days. It's no wonder that in our time, real rest can feel so elusive. And yet, in the midst of it all, our hearts long for rest, don't they? They long for calm and peace, not just for a nap or a break or a vacation, although those things are great, as we all know, and they matter, but for something deeper, a kind of rest that doesn't just pause the busyness, but reorients us to an entirely alternative way of being in the world. That's why tonight I want to invite us into a reflection on what the contemplative tradition calls the beginningless and endless rest of God. James Finley puts it like this: sometimes in the midst of nature, in the arms of our beloved, the presence of a child, the pause between two lines of a poem, or a quiet hour at day's end, our hearts are grazed by the oneness of God, a beginningless and endless resting in God. Isn't that beautiful? He names these small, ordinary moments like a walk outside or a hug, a poem, the quiet at day's end, as places where our hearts are touched by something vast, something beginningless and endless, which I think is to say infinite, something that has always been true, the rest of God. But if we're being honest, rest doesn't always feel this close, does it? We live in a restless culture. Our news cycles are full of outrage. Our politics are churning with division and fear. Our calendars are crowded, like we said. Our nervous systems especially are on high alert. Sometimes it feels like the river of anxiety just sweeps us along with it. And so when we hear about a beginningless and endless rest, it can sound ethereal, like way too lofty, almost unreachable, right? It sounds like a nice mystical idea, but not much more than that, and not something we can access on a Wednesday afternoon when our email inbox is overflowing or when another headline makes our stomachs tighten. But what Finley and the contemplative tradition are inviting us to see is that this rest isn't a reward we get after everything else is finished. It's not the weekend after a long week or a retirement after a long career. That means that rest isn't something that we earn like you can accrue vacation days at work. Rest is the very ground of our becoming lives. It's the oneness of God in which we already live and move and have our being. I've come to see that reality itself isn't fixed or rigid, but it's always unfolding, it's always in motion, always becoming, and that is the nature of things, process. We are all in process, aren't we? But in the midst of that unfolding, what carries it all, what holds us, is the embrace of love. Not a love that waits for us somewhere else or sometime later, but a love that is here, now, underneath everything. And sometimes, if we're just a little attentive, we catch a glimpse of it. We can taste it. I noticed this again recently while I was away. For the first few days, I carried the stress with me, right? You know how that goes as you orient to your time away. Research shows we need even like 3 full days of rest to adjust to vacation mode, aka long weekends just quite aren't enough. They're just the beginning of rest, right? So at about 3 days away on my trip, all the worries and busyness I packed into my carry-on decided to show up and come rushing in, whether I wanted them to or not. And so at some point, I just had to let it out, like an exhale that had been waiting. I, was shedding some tears. I ended up having a conversation with my wife about everything I was feeling. But then, through that process, there was a little catharsis. And then I was able to enter in for a bit for the rest of the trip and be present with my kids. And though, as we got toward the end of the trip, I sat reflecting on the days ahead, and I started to feel the unrest start to well up again, thinking about everything I had to return to, all my responsibilities and the noise and the busyness of all that we've got going on this fall. And so I felt like I was back in it a little bit. And then it struck me. Rest has got to be something different entirely. It can't only be a pause between the stretches of busyness. It has to be something deeper, something always available, even when life is swirling about like it tends to do. And I think in some sense, that's what Finley's pointing to in those little mundane moments that become windows into something vast. That silence in a poem, the quiet at day's end. There are these small openings into the oneness of God, into a rest that is beginningless and endless and just is. And here's the reality. That rest can't be taken away from us, no matter what happens to us, because it isn't about circumstances lining up. It isn't about perfect conditions. It's more about who we are at the root. And what we are, as I've said before, is an instantiation, living and breathing, and an intimation, a sacred expression of divine love. And it's through that access point of knowing this, again, not head knowing, but rather experiencing, that we can sink the taproot of our hearts into something deeper than our situations, deeper than the chaos of our times, deeper than our own racing thoughts. This is why, to me, a theological worldview or some spiritual worldview that enables you to sacralize the world, to drench it with beauty and awe and wonder and especially value or dignity again, is so vital in a world that continues down the path of nihilism. And I think this is also why James Finley says that the final mystical truth is that there is nothing missing anywhere. He says that's what we're all waiting to hear, but we don't have the ability to until our ears perk up a bit after life knocks us around, And what he means by that is this. God is loving us through and through and through, despite our situations. Through and through and through sadness and all, through and through and through struggles and fears and worries and all, loving us through and through and through joy and celebration and all. Even when life feels fragmented, incomplete, and overwhelming, there's a fullness at the heart of things. And that fullness is love. And it's holding us even if we can't feel it. But if nothing is missing, what do we do with these wounds we all carry, right? Thanks for saying nothing's missing, Tim, but I'm hurting, How do they fit into this picture of rest? At this point, you might be wondering, what does it even mean to say that there's something like beginningless and endless rest in God? I think in some sense, it means that there's an unwoundedness amidst the wounds we all have. I don't particularly like the narrative that we're broken people. I know a lot of people say that, like we're all broken, But I think brokenness to me feels kind of like a Lego structure that's fallen apart and lost its continuity, or a machine that's just not functioning anymore. And God, that feels like a bad place to start for me. What might be more helpful is to say that we all have inherited wounds. Some of them are generational, some are personal from our life history. And that, yes, there is a depth to us that moves down, in, and through us that can, when encountered, hold and even transform our woundedness. I remember the first time I really contemplated that. We've all heard that God loves us, but to really consider for a moment and to open ourselves for a moment to the possibility that beneath our own woundedness, there was an unwounded center. At least I just initially couldn't believe that could be true. That just sounded crazy. I've come to believe, though, that 1,000 spiritual directors or therapists or pastors or gurus they could tell you this until they're blue in the face, but it won't make any sense or it won't be real for us until we come home to that deep place of self-acceptance, where both myself and God mutually disappear as other from each other, and we can come home to this oneness. This is what I mean by rest, that you are not broken, but that you are beloved despite your wounds. And we all have our wounds, right? I have mine, you have yours. But we have to change our thinking from that our wounds are what make us broken to our wounds are part of what make us human, and there's a wholeness about you that includes your wounds. In this is the beginningless and endless rest of God. And the good news is that each of us have access to this point of rest for no reason other than the fact that we exist, right? That's the only requirement to find it. I don't need to be a mediator for you. No other priest or guru does. The reality is, it's there beneath all our conceived narratives of not good enough or not whole enough. It's there beneath all our confusions about our place or our purpose in the world. It's there beneath our busyness and the performative achievements we chase after. It's there as the opening of your own soul back to the world in loving embrace. And I feel that this is exactly what Jesus was getting at in Matthew's gospel when he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my ways upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls. For my way will ease you, and my burden is light." Friends, these aren't words about a personal relationship with Jesus. Sorry, They're the words of a Jewish mystic who knew what it meant to enter into the very rest of God. Perhaps to take on Christ's way is to step into alignment with the infinite rhythm of divine love, which never exhausts but always sustains. Perhaps his way that eases, quote unquote, is not the absence of effort, but the discovery that when our lives move in harmony with this beginningless and endless rest, even the weight of life can be carried lightly. Perhaps Jesus is pointing us to the same ground of love that Finley describes, the inexhaustible, eternal rest of God that undergirds every moment of our lives. Another way to say this is that, as Rob Bell has said, who you are is beloved and who you aren't isn't interesting. Now, if we're being honest, realizing that doesn't mean that life suddenly becomes easy, right? It doesn't mean that politics calm down or that the bills vanish or the anxiety never returns. But it does mean that alongside those realities, we can hold on to something deeper. And in doing so, we're less likely to be carried down the river by the agitation of our limbic systems. We're less likely to mistake our unrest for our deepest truth. And we often tend toward thinking that we are what has wounded us, don't we? We take it on as an identity. The invitation then is not to escape our lives, but to let these little windows of rest remind us what is always true, that we're being held in this beginningless and endless rest in God. And from that place, even the smallest taste of calm becomes something that we can carry with us into our meetings and our marriages, into our conflicts and our headlines, into the long days. Perhaps rest isn't the product waiting at the end of our time away, but the posture we bring into the time away, the openness within us that allows our time away to rejuvenate us from within. So maybe the question for us tonight isn't, how can I find rest? But how can I remember the rest that is already holding me? How can I uncover it? And perhaps the deeper invitation is this, to let these moments of divine rest form us into a new way of living and seeing. To recognize that rest doesn't mean the absence of wounds, but the presence of a deeper wholeness beneath them. It's the unwounded center that can hold our hurts without collapsing into them, and the embrace of love that whispers, we are not broken, but beloved. To carry the oneness of God into a divided world, to embody calm in a time of anxiety, to offer gentleness in an age of outrage is the call. Because the beginningless and endless rest of God is not just for our own comfort, it's for our transformation. And when we live from that place, there's more rest in the midst of a restless world. Okay, I want to offer us 3 questions for contemplation and conversation, and we'll start with the self question. Where in your own life do you feel the tug of restlessness most strongly? And how might you open yourself to the unwounded center of rest that is already within you? Number 2, the sacred question. If the beginningless and endless rest of God isn't something we achieve, but something always holding us, what practices or moments help you notice and trust that presence? And lastly, the society question. In a world so shaped by busyness, outrage, and productivity, what might it look like for us as a community together to embody a countercultural rest in Santa Barbara and beyond? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.